They thought it was just gonna be a fun getaway. 8 friends in a cabin with some good food, a drink or two, and 8 cubes.
Oh my god, I can't wait to show you all the cards I've added. I think you're really gonna like them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're all going to have some really super useful feedback for me.
But it turns out that something sinister was lurking right beneath the surface.
Doan's cutie seems almost unbeatable. This Pinger's deck seemed wide open in my seat, but I think it's a trap.
And when you put 5 of the most opinionated cube designers in one room with multiple cases of wine, the sparks are gonna fly.
So I jumped through a bunch of hoops to kill Judith, and you just had another copy of Judith in hand?
No. Not another disenchant.
Oh my god, you cut directly to Nexus of Fate again? Ah!
This summer, it's Cube Cabin in the Woods.
My whole deck is just Ornithopters and artifacts and enchantments to turn them into threats. What kind of monster puts so many disenchants in a cube like that?
And then they drafted the regular cube.
This one's actually good. I like it.
Yeah, no complaints for me.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, owner of the most unimpeachably beloved cube at Cube Cabin 2025, Maddox.
What can I say? If your goal is just not to be criticized, I know how to figure that out, I guess.
Yeah, also definitely the most stable cube at Cube Cabin, had not been changed in God knows how long.
I'm glad that I brought regular cube. You know, it wasn't exciting or splashy, but I think that we had a lot going on there, and it was nice to have something that was, like you say, pretty stable, pretty approachable. We needed that. You need a little palate cleanser.
Yeah, hindsight 2020, I wish I had just brought in Sacred Geometry as well.
I'm glad you didn't.
Why?
Because I got to play the Ornithopter cube and crush people.
Oh, because you get to 3-0, sure. We just got back from a little weekend with 6 of our best internet buds to play cube all weekend. We brought 8 people, 8 cubes, 1 cabin, 1 draft per cube, and then lots and lots and lots of discourse around those drafts. And we thought we'd dedicate this episode to talking about those drafts and what we learned from them, and a tournament report of sorts, except there is no tournament.
Yeah.
It was just 8 people in a cabin.
New cube event format just dropped. We've seen the weekly cube nights. We've seen the few hundred people or 64-player cube tournaments. This is the 8-player maximum intensity cube retreat.
Yeah, it's like being locked in a room.
That, you know, we all got to the cabin and you know, just a friend of ours organized this and was like, hey, you know, you 7 folks, can you make it to this cube cabin? Bring your cube, we'll make some food and have a good time. And it was really funny how we all showed up and we're all kind of like getting a glass of water, like figuring out where we're putting our bags and stuff. And I'm just like, this is just like the beginning of an episode of Documental, and it's about to get really weird, isn't it?
It was Documental, but for cube weirdos, for sure. And I gotta say, you know, I think emotions ran high. There was more salt in this cabin than I anticipated.
It was a salty cabin.
It was a salty cabin.
I feel like I want to attribute a lot of that to just the fact that, you know, the people that were invited were pretty intensely enfranchised cube players that are often the people that are bringing a cube to an event or organizing their own local play groups. So there were a lot of people that were sort of used to being in the leadership position and expressing their own taste and sort of shaping the event around their own taste. And when all of those own tastes kind of get together, maybe there's a little bit of tension.
Well, you know, I wanted a bunch of critical feedback on my cube. That was like the point to me, is like, you know,
Sure,
a dedicated draft. So like I was looking for a bunch of critical feedback.
You also have experience of going to an art school where accepting critical feedback was a huge part of what you learned in that experience.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you know, maybe that expectation was not as clearly set with everybody as it should have been. But you know what? Let's just talk about these drafts and get into it, because we do have 8 separate drafts to cover, and you and I each did our own draft of each cube, obviously. So that's a lot of drafts to cover. The first cube was the Drownyard. This is a relatively new cube by Greg, the organizer of all the Vertex cube events and other cube stuff. And this is a heavily blue cube. It leans heavily blue. It is, I would say, like a regular cube power level, maybe a little more sort of power outliers, but I think on average, probably about regular cube power level in terms of the individual cards. You're playing some kind of broken stuff and some jank alongside it in basically every deck, as best I can tell. And I think this is a really cool, unexplored cube space. There's a couple other cubes out there that are like, leaning very heavily into color imbalance while not being like strictly, there's no green in this cube or whatever. And I think that's a really cool space. This cube is mostly blue, and the second most popular color is definitely black, and then red, and then green and white, I think. Green and white are tied for the least amount of cards in those colors. And it leads to a really interesting sort of weighting of certain type of effects and decks in the draft. I played Grixis, and I was going to be just blue-black until I got a Kess past me in pack 3. It was only passed once or twice, but more times than I would expected Kess to be passed, because this is a more lower power level environment, and I did not expect that to come to me so late. And the highlights of this draft for me were, one, I got to beat Dovin's Acuity, which was a card that Greg messed everybody up with and ended up getting the 3-0 with, but I did get to beat Dovin's Acuity in a sort of face-up match. This is a 3-mana enchantment that on ETB, it draws you a card and gains you 2 life, and then if you cast an instant during your own main phase, you get to pick it back up and put it back in your hand, which proved to be very grindy in an environment that is very grindy by definition almost. Other highlights for me, got to play with Suffocating Blast, one of my favorite spells that I often can never find a place for. It's a 4-mana counterspell that also deals 3 damage to any target creature. And the reason it's not incredible is that you have to have a creature to target with that 3 damage. Otherwise, it is just a dead card in your hand. Or worst case scenario, you got to kill one of your own things if you really can't let that creature spell or that spell resolve. But I got to do the thing multiple times with it, and it is a total utter beating when you get to actually 2-for-1 somebody with a counterspell like that. It is so strong.
Yeah, the fact that Dovin's Acuity is like a really powerful card here, I think speaks to how much this environment felt like it was really about engine building and putting together these sort of loops that are not like combos in the high power combo sense necessarily, but, just trying to like slowly create incremental value with these loops. And I also got ground out by Dovin's Acuity, so
if the environment was about engine building, I did not do that. I just had kind of a pretty fair Grixis deck with like good removal and decent creatures. And
you don't
advantage.
think like Kess is kind of a little bit in that zone of just like, yeah, you're not doing
a self-contained engine, a 1-card engine in a way, sure.
Sort of how it feels to me. My deck was blue-black. I was pretty heavily black with a couple good blue spells and a little bit of green as well. The thing that I was picking up on was there were a lot of cards that just cared about moving things between zones. There's like a ton of graveyardy stuff, but there's also some of the Eldrazi ingesters and processors, which care about exiling stuff and then putting it back in the graveyard, stuff that bounces your own creatures for value, stuff that sacrifices your own creatures for value. And that was a lot of fun. That's like a kind of playstyle that I really enjoy. I mean, Species Gorger is not exactly White Mane Lion, but it's not totally different from it. And the idea of, play your Species Gorger, which is an overset creature that forces you to bounce things back to your hand, but then you play Venser and you pick up Venser every turn and get to bounce stuff. That was a really fun thing. This was Greg's cube, and I got to play Dinrova Horror in it, which felt very appropriate. And also just had like a couple interesting outliers like Gruesome Menagerie, which just brings a bunch of stuff back from your graveyard, which I have a lot of fun casting. I ended up 2-1 here as well. I lost in the finals to Greg. Yeah, my engine building seemed good, but it was interesting. It felt like pretty powerful in the first 2 matches because my opponent didn't have as much removal to disrupt those things. But then when I'm playing my Species Gorger and Greg has a ton of removal and can just kill everything else, it's like, okay, well now I can just never keep anything in play because I'm trying to like turn these downsides into upsides. So that match felt really different from my other matches, which honestly was a theme for me of the weekend. That Greg
matches feeling different.
Matches against Greg feeling like I'm not sure we're playing the same cube.
Greg had an incredible record over the weekend and just really kind of showed us all up.
So soundly, easily lost the finals there, but had a good time. And this is a kind of cube that I definitely love to get some more experience with because I feel like there's a lot to explore. And I really like that sort of light constraint of being like, well, this is heavily blue. It's about these kinds of colors and focusing on things. It's not as strict as just saying like these 2 colors don't exist at all.
I would really encourage people listening that have a favorite color or color pair to consider building a cube like this that's about those color pairs instead of one that just sort of fully removes colors completely, because every kind of effect was present here. You could do all the sort of range of things that are possible in Magic. It's just a relative density, right? It's like you're sitting down to draft a regular cube, but blue-black being open at your seat every time, to some degree, which to me is so much more interesting and leads to so much more kind of compelling texture than the sort of full color commitment cubes, which we've seen a lot of, and, no shade to any of them, but they are often like kind of one-notey a little bit, or they run the risk of being a little one-notey, and just the range we saw in the decks in this particular draft from this cube, I think that will not be the case in this environment.
Yeah, I mean, in general, just any kind of cube restriction or cube theme, if you take that and say, like, well, let's do 50% of it instead of 100% of it, I tend to find them a lot more compelling.
Yeah, you have a lot more interesting range than with what you do with that other 50%.
One exception being maybe something like the Ornithopter cube, because that kind of depends on commitment to the bit.
Sure. Arguably, it's also not even that fun of a cube, so what are you going to do?
Well, we'll get there.
The next draft was of the oldest school. This is the cube of a member of our local play group, and I've played this cube a lot. I like this cube. It is basically old school Magic, but the bad cards, not instead of old school Magic, but the good cards. There's a lot of nostalgia-based old Border or 94, 95 cubes out there that are playing the best cards from those eras, and this one is kind of playing what was probably likely more like kitchen table decks of that era against each other.
I mean, and specifically, it was designed as a foil to your neoclassical cube, saying like, oh, well, there's other bad cards that you're not playing in the neoclassical cube. I want to make a cube where those can be played. And the designer also has experience from playing in that era and playing kitchen table in that era, I think. So it's a very, very direct sort of nostalgic project for him.
The original rule was nothing that is in neoclassical cube is allowed in this cube, and now I think the goals are better articulated as Sarah Angel is probably the best card in the cube, and you should take it first over almost anything else, and everything flows from there. A cube where Sarah Angel is the best card, and all the cards are old school. I got very excited about my deck. This is probably the most fun draft I had all weekend in terms of the actual draft
You
portion.
were giddy.
I was squealing like a school child because my pack one pick one was Prodigal Sorcerer, Timmy, the old 3-mana 1/1 blue card that pings for 1. Then I saw pick 3 or 4 an Intruder Alarm, and I said, I will wield the Intruder Alarm. No one wants that card. It's, bad, basically, and you only can be in one deck and want it. And I did, in fact, wield the Intruder Alarm and got everything I wanted for this deck. The cards that had me squealing with joy most were, I picked up a Skeleton Ship late, which is obviously not a pinger, but cares about tapping and untapping, and so works with Intruder Alarm and all that kind of stuff. And I also got Curiosity relatively late after I already had 3 or 4 pingers in my deck, which is fantastic. Turns on card advantage, from those little pinger cards. The games did not play out very well for me. It was kind of a huge train wreck. I did win one match, and in that match, I did get to do my deck's thing. I got to put out Intruder Alarm and start pinging stuff to death, and it was really cool. I think this deck struggled more than I expected it to, because the removal is notoriously bad here. He doesn't want anything or very few cards that can 1-for-1 a card like Sarah Angel. I think maybe Terror is the only one right now. There's a couple other cards that can answer it with a little bit of work by jumping through a hoop or two, but I think there's only one card that cleanly answers Sarah Angel, and it is appropriately Terror.
I mean, I had Oubliette as well, which arguably does, but it's also answerable. If you have a disenchant.
Yeah. So anyway, the removal is kind of bad, but I found that a lot of the bad removal was still able to remove all my 1 toughness, important sort of engine creatures, and so it ended up turning on all of my opponents' otherwise janky removal and turning it into good removal against me. But it was a total delight when I got to pop off with my little tap engine and Intruder Alarm and basically lock my opponent under the, if you play a creature, I will untap everything and kill you. So what are you going to do now? Kind of lock, which was kind of cool. The other thing I did with this deck, which was awesome, is I was playing Exhaustion, which is a 3-mana sorcery that says your opponent doesn't untap their creatures or lands during the next untap step.
There are a couple cards like that in this cube, and they kind of mess with you more than I expect they would. If I saw that in a contemporary limited format, I'd be like, well, that card sucks. You should never play that.
I think you're misevaluating it.
Maybe.
I mean,
and by contemporary limited, I mean limited from a couple years ago.
Limited you're used to. I mean, I think that card is actually quite fine. Just on rate, I think it's totally fine. It's some portion of a time walk. It is obviously not a time walk. It doesn't replace itself. But in terms of the tempo, it is basically a time walk, assuming your opponent is tapped out. I had ways to buy it back with these 5-mana Eternal Witness creatures that are really janky and low statted. I had a game against one of my opponents where they played Lethal Vapors, which is that enchantment which says you can pay a turn to get rid of it. Otherwise, every creature that comes into play is immediately destroyed. And so you have to give your opponent a free turn, basically, to destroy it. Any player can do that. Really weird card. And my opponent played it on basically an empty board. And they had a few ways to break parity. They had some creatures with ETBs that were valuable even though they were immediately destroyed. And they had, some creatures they wanted to put in the graveyard. So there was some way they were using it to their advantage. But eventually, I did just kind of force them to actually break their own Lethal Vapors. And by that time, I had the Exhaustion and all the ways to get it back in my hand. And I just exhausted them back to back for a bunch of turns. And it definitely worked. So that was really cool too.
I had a little bit of a rough time in this draft just in terms of navigating a synergistic deck. I started on like a green-red card that is pretty reasonable and got pulled in a lot of directions by some of the cards that I know are kind of power outliers. I got like a Sengir Vampire at one point, a Cone of Flame, which is like one of the best removal spells. It's kind of basically Plague Wind. I ended up going into black for some things like Royal Assassin and Sorcerer's Queen. But also, I got this Endless Worm very early, which is a huge oversat creature, but you have to sacrifice an enchantment every turn to keep it alive. And sort of tried to cobble that together. Also got a late Verduran Enchantress and like maybe just enough enchantments to make it work. But it felt like a lot of my games, even with like my mana was not great, but I mostly was fine there. But just had some weird interactions where it just felt like the cards weren't working together. Like, oh, I had one turn where my opponent has a huge threat I need to kill, and I have my Royal Assassin, and their creature's tapped, and I have Instill Energy. This is an enchantment, which I'm mostly just playing to trigger my enchantment stuff, but it gives a creature haste, so I'll put this to my Royal Assassin and be able to get their huge threat. Turns out it doesn't give the creature haste, it allows the creature to attack as though it had haste, so that didn't really work very well. And some similar situations like that. I also had Endless Worm in play at one point and was going to flash in an enchantment during my upkeep to be able to sacrifice it to that trigger. My opponent cast an exhaustion type effect, which meant I didn't have mana to be able to cast that, so I just like cast my Endless Worm without having any enchantments just to have it die anyway, which was a little bit disappointing. And then I also got pulled into, just because I like saw these cards and I guess they were enchantments, Pariah and Uncle Estevan as a combo that is just too appealing for me not to try, and never really got that off. So I don't know, this deck I think had high hopes, but it was trying to do too much at once and didn't really work for those reasons, even though I had a couple of individual cards that were pretty powerful.
Was I your only match win?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that should say something, because my deck was not great.
Cone of Flame was very good against your deck specifically, because
sure
you
was.
had a bunch of little creatures that you were trying to get out there, and I also had some other small removal. Another really funny experience, my opponent had Colossus of Sardia, which is a huge creature, but you have to pay 9 mana to untap it. One of my removal spells is Paralyze, which is tap down a creature, but they can pay 4 mana during their upkeep to untap it. So I'm like, okay, great, I can tap down your Colossus of Sardia and make it much, much better. That doesn't seem great for me.
Yeah, not what you really want to be doing in the face of a Colossus of Sardia, generally speaking.
Still had fun games. This is a cube that I enjoy playing, and we'll look forward to try and do better next time.
Next up, we were drafting Joe's Anarchy Cube of Joe, who was on last week's episode of Lucky Paper Radio. We talked a lot about this cube last week. I'll refer you to that episode if you want to know more about it, but in a nutshell, it is a vintage cube with all of the most busted and like kind of out there crazy stuff that you can do in Vintage Cube.
And stuff you can't do in Vintage Cube, like stuff that is not legal cards,
Yeah.
or stuff that is cards that Joe has made up, or stuff that Joe has modified, and the Power Pack, and Lore Seeker, and there's a lot going on in this cube.
There is a lot going on in this cube for sure.
How do you feel about this cube?
I mean, it's not my favorite kind of Magic. I think that's obvious to anybody that's ever listened to this podcast before. I don't love Power Max Magic. I also don't love complicated rules modified Magic, but I was saying this to Joe, like, I'd still rather draft this cube than play almost any board game, right? Like, it's, I think, hard when you hear criticisms of a cube because you're like, oh, it hits so personally and it feels like, you know, this person hates this thing, obviously. And it's like, no, I mean, it's just, if we're comparing it to other cubes, this is not the cube I would choose, but I still love playing Magic. I still love drafting cube, and I had a great time in this particular draft as well. I'm trying to remember my pick order in the draft, but I know that I very early on staked out mono white. I think it was pack 1. I think I'd spent my Cogworker Librarian and took Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and something else very good. I forget what it was at this moment. Look at my deck picture now, trying to figure out. It might have been Esper Sentinel, maybe? Esper Sentinel and Thalia as an early start. And yeah, just kind of like decided to go in that direction. The Power Pack got opened 2 seats away from me, and Power Play made it to me, which is a conspiracy that says you always get to go first every single game, every single match. And I took that, snapped it up, and was like fully committed to my mono white aggro strategy. It then wheeled all the way around the table, and when it came back, I got Mana Crypt out of the Power Pack, which tells you how powerful the cards in the Power Pack were, because Mana Crypt made it all the way around the table, +2.
Right. To be clear, it is like a pack that contains 8 of the Power 9 that you'd expect, plus a bunch of conspiracies, which are all more broken than the Power 9, and some other cards that are just crazy cards.
A couple Pokemon cards that
Some
Joe has
Pokemon
errata
cards.
basically to work in Magic.
And
There's
also Contract from Below, which is an early Magic
Yeah.
card that references Ante, so you can't play it in any format, but is basically just a 1-mana black draw 7.
which Joe does make you actually follow the anti-rules here, too. You do end up anteing a card from your deck, which is a real cost over the course of an entire cube draft, obviously. So yeah, the fact that I got Mana Crypt back really tells you how messed up this pack was. And I ended up in a really, really strong mono-white aggro deck. I did have White Plume Adventurer. I had Knight of the Kitchen Sink, which for those that don't know is a 2-mana 2/1 with first strike and protection from Black Bordered.
Depending on which version of Knight of the Kitchen Sink you have, there are like 4 different printings with
this
different
is the only one I've
effects.
ever seen, because it's the only one that matters, basically. The standouts for me were obviously all the power. The power was great. We loved that. I did have Ephemerate and Solitude as well, so I had some like reasonable answers. I had an opponent that was on a Reanimator deck, and I just had so many ways to answer the Reanimated threat in my aggro deck. I had Path to Exile, I had Solitude, I had Ephemerate for my Solitude, I had Touch of Spirit Realm, I had Palace Jailer, I had I think one other way basically to answer Reanimated stuff. It was just like my deck did it all, basically. I ended up getting 3-0 with this deck, which I think shows that it's a success in the way that Joe described, because I'm never drafted this cube before. I'm not a big vintage cube aficionado. I did not know the card pool front to back, and yet I was able to get the 3-0, which I think is one of the things that Joe values, if you listen to last week's episode about this cube, is that it does make the sort of fun and excitement of winning a draft much more accessible to people that are maybe not the most enfranchised. And yeah, I just kind of sat down and based on the first couple packs, hard-forced mono-white aggro and got there, did the thing.
I did something not too dissimilar. I think my first picks were Ragavan and then Orcish Bowmasters, and then found my way into mostly Boros aggro, which I felt honestly mostly comfortable drafting this because I've heard Joe on his podcast and when he's been interviewed on other podcasts talk about how this is his favorite kind of deck to draft in his cube as well as in any other cube. So I knew a lot of the specific cards that he often calls out as being really powerful. So I did end up with Comet, although I never actually drew Comet, but also Fourth Eorlingus, Ajani, Nacatl Pariah, Gut, Broadside Bombardiers, Lelia, Fable the Mirror Breaker. Like my 3-drops were just all the like sort of most legendary red 3-drops that are extremely powerful. I ended up doing pretty well with this deck as well. I ended up meeting you in the finals where you crushed me. But before that, I was just curving out ridiculous aggro stuff.
Yeah, my deck was nasty. I crushed everybody. 3-0, 6-0. Very strong. Even though you were taking some white aggro cards and you were passing directly to me in the draft. You were seated to my right. Still got there. So yeah, I think Biggest Cube really succeeds in its goals, which is high praise. Joe has custom sleeves designed for the cube, which are very sort of thematic.
I do like the custom sleeves.
Custom sleeves are awesome, and it's really fun if you get to play it with Joe. You'll hear stories about every single card in the cube and the amazing times people have cast them and the crazy stuff they've done. So the cube was a huge success in what Joe was seeking, and it got me my only trophy pin of the weekend, so I was very happy with that.
Congrats.
Next up was the regular cube. We've talked about this cube more than maybe any cube on this podcast ever. It is your primary cube, Anthony. For those that are listening for the first time, every episode is someone's first episode. What's the 30-second pitch of the regular cube?
So this is my main cube, which is sort of designed to emulate a lot that I love about limited Magic. So it's a lot of just creatures playing to the board, combat tricks. There's light synergies, but it's not designed in a way that a lot of lower powered cubes are, where there's not a strict sort of archetype to every 2-color pair. Instead, most of the decks are kind of mixing and matching and trying to get the best value from a couple different themes. It was very, very different from the Anarchy cube, and I think maybe a palate cleanser that helped sort of... We were feeling a little salty at this point, as we mentioned at the top of the episode.
I would say almost every draft, except for this draft of the regular cube, had people feeling salty afterwards. Certain people were like, this is not my kind of cube. I mean, like, one player was just like, I hate old borders. I hate looking at them. They're ugly. I hate them. It's just like preemptively salty
and
around.
Then he won that cube.
No, he didn't.
Didn't he?
Nope.
Okay, never mind.
So I think that was just the nature of like everyone bringing kind of mostly out there experimental cube lists to this event. And also, just playing a ton of Magic over the course of an entire weekend, and in a place where a lot of us are expecting critical feedback and looking forward to giving it, is, the salt will flow sometimes. I drafted blue-white control in this draft. I forget what my very first pick was, but I think pick 2 I got Maze Mind Tome, and then I got a pretty early Azorius Chancery as well, and was kind of all in on this blue-white control deck. And I think my deck ended up very strong. I have, I think, a good combination of threats and answers. I have a board wipe. I have 2 planeswalkers in a board wipe deck, which is extremely hard to come by in this cube because there's all of 3 or 4 planeswalkers in the entire cube. So I had most of the planeswalkers in my board wipe deck, which was good. I had Muldrifter Ephemerate, which maybe not the thing that you want to let people do in the regular cube. Feels a little bit spiky in the power level, but I loved it getting to do it because it's broken, obviously. That was really cool. Ended up going 1-2 in this draft, but I loved every single match that I played, and I still, at the end, think my deck was actually quite good. Which, again, maybe that's just cope, maybe I'm wrong, but I think my deck was very strong, and through a combination of like a little bit of bad beats and mostly my opponents playing really well, I did end up 1-2 In the final match, I'd lost to Joe, who was playing red-green aggro, and notably, he beat me in 2 games. I didn't take a single game off of him. In both those games, I got to enough mana to cast Route at instant speed, and did so, and still lost against a red-green control deck, or red-green aggro deck, rather, that was just playing creatures to the board and attacking me. Joe brilliantly navigated never overcommitting to the board and not actually rushing, which is a mistake I find people often make when they're playing an aggro deck. They assume that no matter what, my goal is just to always be sacrificing cards to get damage through, and Joe was playing very slowly and methodically in a way that I had plenty of time and still could not beat him, which I thought was a really great example of how to pilot a deck like that. Yeah, I've never cast an instant speed route in my life until that match, and I did it twice, and it was well, this is I gotta win if I cast instant speed route, surely.
It's pretty fun.
I cast instant speed route on my opponent's end step and then followed up with Muldrifter and then lost. It's I really quite something.
It can happen. I first picked a great white heroic payoff here, and then I was also looking at a Black Aristocrats card, ended up wheeling the Black Aristocrats card, and after sort of seeing how that first pack had gone, was okay, black feels actually much more open. I abandoned my first pick, ended up in a black-red Aristocrats deck with a little bit of a zombie theme. There was one pack in particular that was really late that had both Diagraph Colossus and Crypt Breaker, and I was okay, now's my chance. I'm probably not going to wheel the other one of these, but let's take this Crypt Breaker and jump into zombies. Unfortunately, I think a couple other people picked up on the same signal.
I think that pack also had Gravecrawler in it at a different point.
Oh no, that explains things.
Yeah.
So yeah, my deck came out okay. I didn't do well. I ended up 1-2 as well in my own cube, which is fine. It happens. This is a difficult environment, and we have a lot of really, really great players at this table, so yeah, I was not feeling necessarily confident here. I had a great black removal suite, which I think was what was the best part of this deck, but some really key pieces that were missing. So I had Felled into the Third Path, which I think is very good, but I really needed that Sling-Gang Lieutenant as a creature that can both sacrifice itself and then recur for value, or
sure.
1 or 2 other good creatures to be able to reanimate with that, or just some more effective, I have my Blood Artist, but not a lot of redundancy for it, so my engine could be picked apart pretty easily. And then Bolas' Citadel I got very late, and I was excited about it, but I just, even with all the removal I had, I wasn't able to keep my life total high enough before I hit 6 mana to be able to really take advantage of that. So I think there's a lot of easy lessons learned here, and also my mana fixing was completely horrible. I don't know how that happened. There was one pack where I knew I could have taken a Raucous Theater, but that was a pack that had Blood Artist in it. And, making those decisions about when do you take a really key powerful card or when do you take fixing you really need is one of the tough things about Magic.
While we're on this cube, I do want to mention one card just because I don't think I mentioned it to you, but one card that has always underperformed my expectations in every environment. I had it in Sacred Geometry for a while and I cut it because it never works. It's Protect the Negotiators. It's the blue counterspell that you can kick for a white, and it counters a spell if you control more creatures than its mana value, or unless they pay X for X as the number of creatures you control, one of the two. It only works if you have creatures on board, importantly.
Right.
And the fact that it's a gold card if you kick it, and awful if you don't kick it, means that not only do you have to be a blue-white deck, which I was, but you need to be a blue-white deck, which is playing to the battlefield a lot, which some of the more hard control decks are not. I actually was playing to the battlefield quite a bit. I had a Mischievous Mystic and a bunch of cheap cantripping creatures like Fibblethip the Lost and stuff. So I did expect to have creatures on board, and it's still just the first couple games I had it in, and it just there's nothing. It doesn't do anything. The card just never works for me. Just a small note about that card because it just never works in my experience.
I expect that a slower blue deck is still going to have a creature or two, so this is still a sensor that you can't cycle, but that's still a card.
Sensor you can't cycle is awful.
Okay, that's fair.
I mean, how often do you cycle versus cast Censor? I feel like it's 60% cycled, maybe.
I might hold on to Censor too long, but I think I do like this card as a little bit of a clue to people that are drafting this cube the first time that oh yeah, even if you're playing a blue deck, you're not going to play a blue deck that's just going to have all Wraths and no creatures in play. This is kind of what this cube is about, which even if the card itself is not great, maybe that signal is worth sending.
I think the fact that you see so many blue creatures in the pack sends that message a lot stronger than a card that requires you to read that and kind of do that translation. But anyway, just one observation. I love this cube. Like I said, I loved all my matches. It was some of the most fun I had playing Magic all weekend as compared to drafting or whatever. And I went 1-2. So what does that tell you? That's got to be a high compliment for a cube designer.
I'll take it.
Next up, we drafted my 100 Ornithopters, which is a cube we've talked about on this podcast a fair bit recently. It's a cube where the only creatures are 100 copies of the card Ornithopter. There's a Ristic Studies video about it, which I'll put in the show notes. This was a interesting group to draft it with, because most of the people have played this cube before in this group, which is rare. This cube is mostly drafted with people that have never done it before, because I take it to events, or our local play group is big enough that there's always sort of a group of people that haven't gotten a chance to play it yet that want to.
Yeah, and you're always trying to prioritize, like, if you haven't drafted a cube before, make sure you get in there.
Yeah, I'm always giving priority to anybody that has not played it and wants to play it. So I would say most drafts are either, half or mostly players that have never gotten a chance to actually play the cube before. And this is a very seasoned bunch. You and I have played the cube the most of probably anybody on planet Earth. Everybody else, except for 2 people, had played it multiple times before, sometimes online, sometimes in person. Again, room full of very skilled players, and so I was curious to see how things would play out here. I ended up drafting... First pick, I think, was Skull Clamp, and then I left pack 1 with both Ashnod's Altar and Krark Clan Ironworks, which, in combination with Skull Clamp, is a really powerful card advantage engine. I also got an Enlightened Tutor somewhere in there as well. So I had the beginnings of kind of a messed up combo deck, and I committed pretty hard to like an all-in combo deck, but ultimately fell short in terms of having enough card advantage that was not specifically that Skull Clamp. If I got the Skull Clamp out, I won the game every time, which was only 2 times out of the 6 games, or the, I guess, 8 games I played.
Which I think is a funny thing to highlight. This is a cube where all the creatures are 0/2, and Skull Clamp is still broken.
Well, it is specifically because I had those 2 altars, and then I got Phyrexian Altar in the last pack. So I had every free sack outlet that generates mana, which are the ways that you can then move the Skull Clamp for free to the next Ornithopter, which makes it a combo card. It like kind of degenerate a combo card immediately. My win condition was just Goblin Bombardment and Pia's Revolution, which makes the Goblin Bombardment able to win without having to sacrifice a full 20 Ornithopters, which oftentimes doesn't work. Revolution basically makes them each count for 4 instead of 1, which is a huge difference. And yeah, I was, drawing my whole deck with either Ad Nauseam or the Skull Clamp combo and then going off. What I think I needed was, like, I really struggled. I had a Dawn of the New Age, or Dawn, the 2-mana enchantment that ETBs, and it gets a counter for every creature you control. On your end step, you take a counter off, draw a card, and if you can't, you sacrifice and gain a couple life or something. It's a like incremental card advantage engine, not an explosive one, not what you typically want in the combo decks, because you're only ever drawing 1 additional card per turn, and it's on end step, so you don't get to do anything with that card that turn. I think maybe I should have squeezed it in there, just because the games I lost were ones where I didn't find any of my explosive cards, and so I deck did nothing, kind of. I had a couple of interactive spells that maybe I should have like sided out, or had in the sideboard to start as a more explosive combo deck, and like not try to have my 1 copy of Thoughtseize or my 1 Disenchant. Though it was awesome, I did draw my whole deck, or enough of my deck to win, with Ad Nauseam, and then, as planned, cast a Thoughtseize to clear the counter spell out of my opponent's hand that would have answered my combo, and then just combo it out. Like, I got to do the thing that the card promises, basically. Anyway, that was my draft, which did not go super duper hot, but was always a learning opportunity for me with this cube, is like trying to figure out how to give decks more tools. And the thing I took away from this, which sounds a little bit risky, but I think I want to try, and I'm sure I've gotten so many suggestions for this cube, especially in the aftermath of the Ristic Studies video. So if you've suggested this before, you're now screaming at your phone like, I told you. Great. I'm sure you did. I'm going to try a couple of silence effects, I think, in white, which are the spells that say your opponent can't cast spells this turn, which are like the cleanest way to actually just protect a combo. And the combo decks still remain harder to pull off than some of the more removal heavy decks that are just kind of trying to stop the combo rather than be the combo. And I think a couple silences might go a really long way to making those viable. So
I'm a little skeptical, but I'm curious.
Well, you were playing the deck I was just describing, the sort of all-in removal deck.
It's true, yeah. So I was playing the heal at the table. We've talked about this on previous episodes. Bones, in particular, drafted like the most broken version of this. Maybe you've called it the Disenchantress deck, which
That's a Bones term.
A great term. Like, you have your Enchantress effects, and then you're just destroying everything that your opponent is... Or wait, do you have your Enchantress effects?
I should note there are no more
everything.
Enchantress effects in the cube.
Great.
The name is a carryover. Like all good deck names, it doesn't make any sense anymore.
Make sense.
But it still sticks around.
It's the opposite of Enchantress. So I went into the draft. I was actually looking at that Skull Clamp first pick, but also Duress was in the pack, and I was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna and also for context, I've done pretty well in this cube in the past, drafting like very fair, kind of aggressive decks that are just like, play Ornithopters, make them bigger, get your opponent dead.
I must have taken the Skull Clamp second then, not first,
right.
if you saw it in your pack.
I've tried to draft a more controlling deck and failed miserably, but looking at that duress, I'm just like, look, this gets every single threat in the cube. Like, it doesn't get the Thopters, but it gets everything else. This card's great. Second, I think it was second pick negate, same thing. This deals with everything you care about in the cube. And then also picked up, I think, Dispeller's Capsule and or Seal of Cleansing early. So my plan was just, let's go into Esper, let's get these cards that just deal with all the threats, and then we'll figure out how to recoup some card advantage and find a win condition somewhere along the way. Late in pack 3, or maybe mid pack 3, somewhere late in the draft, Bow of Nylea came around, and I was like, ooh, can my Esper deck support a double green
One
card?
green.
And this card isn't notorious because it can just shuffle cards back into your library from your graveyard. So if you can be doing this like really controlling deck strategy, you can then also prevent yourself from decking while enriching the cards that you're drawing. And it also has other modes that will gain you life or put counters on your Thopters or destroy your opponent's unpants Thopters. So it's just like a really powerful card all around. I looked at my mana base and decided because of some incidental triomes and things, I'd go for it. And then Viridian Revel came around, and I was like, can I support two?
If we got one green card, why not two green cards?
So that was my deck overall. I had a bunch of cheap interaction. I had both of those very powerful cards that just will help you in the long game. Viridian Revels, whenever your artifact your opponent dies, you draw a card.
Whenever an artifact your opponent controls dies.
Yeah, I mean, it says more words than that, but the words are whatever.
You said whenever an artifact opponent dies. Or something like that.
They know what I mean. And then 2 like big draw 3 spells. And what else is going on in here? My only real win conditions were the Aether Spark or Proph's Eidetic Memory. So if I could draw a bunch of cards, I can make a really big Thopter. And then weirdly also, I got this in pack 3, Echoing Boon, which is the conspiracy that doubles all the instant sorceries that you target your own Thopters with, which in my case was just a repeal, which turned out to be very good because I play out a Thopter I don't care about because I don't care about my Thopters except for the one I'm eventually going to kill you with. Repeal my Thopter, repeal your Thopter, and draw 2 cards. And also Twisted Image, which ends up just being I'll sack one of my Thopters and draw 2 cards as well. This deck was nasty. I just killed everything that my opponent was doing except for their Thopters most of the time, which I didn't really care about, and was able to successfully cast Bow and Viridian Revel. So maybe I just got a little bit lucky there, but those cards did so much work. And I think those big draw 3s at the top end, which I was a little bit skeptical of, also, fueled some of my win conditions and just let me break parity when I was just doing a lot of 1-for-1 removal. I had a lot of fun with this deck.
I'm glad you had fun.
I don't know what to say, except for, are you going to ban all these cards now?
No, I mean, we'll talk more about this at length. We talked about it a lot with the other players in this draft, and one of the things I was hoping would bear out in this draft, given that all the players were very skilled and knew the cube pretty well,
is that other people would just take the disenchants
you
also?
wouldn't get disenchants late enough to be able to fill your deck with them, and that just proves not to be the case for a variety of reasons, and we talked a lot about that. We'll probably talk about it more in the show. I do have a couple ideas for things to tweak. I got to point out what was, I think, maybe the grossest spell cast all weekend, which was your opponent had taken the Monarchy with one of the courts, which in theory should be one of the biggest problems for your deck to deal with because you were playing 5 Ornithopters, you said?
5 Ornithopters, and when I played it, I was very scared. It was like, okay, now you have the Monarchy and an enchantment, so I thought it was going to be really hard for me to sort of navigate that because they were potentially going to hold on to the Monarchy for a long time because even if I could remove their enchantment, not going to be able to deal damage to them.
Because you only had the Aether Spark in your entire deck. I guess you had Bow of Nylea too, but also put counters on something. Like you had so few ways to take the Monarchy, basically.
Exactly, yeah.
And the idea being that if you're trying to 1-for-1 removal and your opponent takes the Monarchy, you should just be able to, run them over, basically. You have more cards in them. They'll let them disenchant and duress everything they want. I'm just going to keep the threats coming. But I saw you cast a fully spreed out Requisition Raid, which involved destroying one of their artifacts, one of their enchantments, and putting a single +1/+1 counter on your single Thopter.
Just the one.
To steal the Monarchy and thus unmake all of the hard work they had done to sort of get some advantage.
Yeah, I don't.
So if anything gets banned, it will be Requisition Raid. As much as I love that card because it is so thematic, right? Like I don't mind the removal spells when they're thematic, and the fact that you can put your +1/+1 counters on your Ornithopters with it makes it cool and interesting. And that line is cool, but also too broken, too messed up.
It's been really good for me in other decks as well that were much more fair. To me, the most funny thing about that was I didn't even have an Ornithopter in my hand, but I drew Savin's Reclamation and had surveilled an Ornithopter to my graveyard earlier because I was like, what do I need Ornithopters for? And then they played the court, and I was like, oh shit. Good thing I can reanimate it now. The other card that was a little bit scary to me was Vraska, which, again, it's like I'm looking at all these cards and I'm thinking this can destroy every single threat in the cube, but Vraska's a little bit more resistant, so that took a little bit of work to be able to just make my one Thopter big enough and then remove all the blockers, and it wasn't that big a deal. I killed the Vraska.
You dealt with Vraska too. Yeah, I mean, your deck had it all. And yeah, we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, at some point, about how to continue paying attention to this deck, because I want this deck to happen sometimes. I think the experience you had is a cool experience. I want you to have to put 5 Ornithopters in your deck that you almost never want Ornithopters for. I think that still makes it kind of interesting. Ultimately, that Requisition Raid line is, I think, too messed up, but also very cool. I'm glad it happened once. I'm glad we can talk about it for the rest of time. But yeah, I want it to be like a sometimes treat. And there is this problem in this cube, which is that as appealing as those, duresses and negates and disenchants are, and as relatively few there are, I mean, again, I have continued to sort of cut back on them, and you have to get a majority of them to have your deck be really committed to this strategy. So many other decks just feel like they can't afford to take them in the draft. They're like, I need this combo piece. I, need to take an Ornithopter because my deck doesn't work without Ornithopters. Like, there's so much pressure in the draft that I think it's easiest for players to hand wave away the occasional interactive spell and just say I actually don't need that as bad as I need these other things. I need my mana fixing, I need my Ornithopters, I need my combo pieces. And whether they're right or wrong, that's just how it ends up playing out, I think, most of the time.
That's a really interesting point. And compared to previous drafts I've done of this cube, getting enough Ornithopters is often a big consideration, and especially when I've been very fond of drafting things like Glimpse of Nature and Rite of Harmony, and then from there it's just okay, let's just keep thinking about the Ornithopter count because I'm not going to be able to get it all in pack 3. Often really not in pack 3 because other people are panicking at that point and scooping them up very quickly. But
the fact that you get to not care about that at all and just remove that consideration from your deck building is a huge advantage.
Pack 1, I think I already had 4 or 5, and I sort of felt like that was kind of where I wanted to land, so that felt like it took a lot of pressure off the draft.
Next up was Doubleton Synergy. This is a great cube from Cube Person of the Year last year, Ollie Beeks. That is a cube where there's 2 copies of every single card in the entire cube, and that's it. No rules modifications, no nonsense. You just have 2 copies of every single card, which allows for, I think, more committed synergy decks, because a lot of times the problem with really committed synergy decks in a singleton environment is that you don't have enough redundancy for either your enablers or your payoffs to make it work. And it also makes for a kind of delightfully simple draft because there are many fewer unique cards. Half as many unique cards in the draft makes it a little easier to read packs and sort of read signals in the draft as well, which is kind of interesting. I ended up in a black-green deck, which at the end, Ollie kind of conceded. I was like, what is black-green supposed to do? And Ollie was like, I'm not sure.
I've been there with cubes before.
Yeah, because the gold card that I had 2 of was Cheville, Bane of Monsters, which is a really powerful card. But it's a synergy cube where removal is kind of light, because synergy cubes, you often have to be very intentional with your removal, because otherwise, if people have enough removal spells to just constantly pick apart synergistic engines, then it ends up being not correct to try and do anything synergistic and just to try and play removal and whatever the least synergistic sort of threats in isolation happen to be. And so Cheville doesn't really point me to any sort of particular synergies. And I ended up caring a little bit about my graveyard, but honestly not much. And most of that synergy came entirely from my mono black cards. I was mostly black with splashing green for a couple cards. The highlight of this draft for sure was I had 2 Rotting Regisaurs, 2 Necrogoyfs, 2 Crypt Breakers, and 2 copies of Rancor. And the synergy my deck had was Rotting Regisaur plus Rancor. And I won all the games where I got to Rotting Regisaur plus Rancor people. And if I wasn't doing that, then my deck was probably falling behind the other engines my opponents were putting together. I did get to, on one turn, put a Rotting Regisaur into play. Next turn, untap, discard a Necrogoyf into Madness, put a Necrogoyf into play. Then next turn, untap, I have 2 discard triggers now on my upkeep. I have to discard 2 cards before I draw a card for the turn. But I had 2 Crypt Breakers in play, so I just made both those cards into zombies and got hellbent, therefore negating the downside of both Rotting Regisaur and Necrogoyf, and then just proceeded to then recoup that card advantage by tapping those zombies later to Crypt Breaker to draw cards and lose life. It was just really cool to be able to see these triggers coming down the line and be like, haha, I will just make 2 zombies and keep doing my thing.
I mean, it sounds like fun. I mean, it's interesting. I think that the double cards both impacts the draft, making it a little bit easier to navigate and easier to sort of pull some of these synergies together. It also means potentially if you have the doubles, if you drafted the doubles, your deck is just more likely to do its thing. There are so many cube drafts where I've drafted a particular pair of cards that I expect to work in a certain way, and then you just never draw them together. So I think that definitely can impact the environment.
Yeah, the other thing that's really cool about this cube I want to mention before we hear about your draft specifically is that there's a lot of legends in this cube. And I think if you actually look around almost every cube these days, there's just a ton of legends running around because Commander has led to them printing many, many more legends. And so there's a lot of cards that just happen to be legends, which in a typical cube basically it doesn't matter. I mean, aside from if you're playing like Power Max environments and you play things like Caracas, where their card is legendary in a singleton environment often is kind of irrelevant, right? You can't copy with Kiki Jiki. You can bounce it with Caracas.
I found it's actually pretty impactful for the channel lands, like a Ganjo. It's just like so often that costs one.
Tiny little things come up in those sort of circumstances too. But this cube, there's a ton of legends, and the fact that they're legends really matters because you have 2 copies of a lot of them, right? And oftentimes if you get one of those gold cards or one of those legends, you can pretty reliably wield the other one because you're in the deck that wants that card. And so I think it's very easy to end up with multiple copies of legends, and I think it's very cool that the legendary super type matters in a very real way in this cube. And, players have a lot of fun baiting their opponent into removing their Judith so they can just play another Judith right afterwards, like realizing that actually that one didn't matter to me at all because I had a whole other one waiting in the wings. It was a dead card. Some people even, had the opposite feeling, of feeling really frustrated that they removed their opponent's threat, then they just played another one, and that was really frustrating to them. There was even a moment, I think, where the Judith player found it was correct to cast another Judith, even though they already had Judith in play, because getting the triggers from both Judith when you were sacrificing to the legendary rule was just enough to win the game or turn the corner on that turn, which was kind of cool. Yeah, was worth a card, basically.
My deck I ended up in was sort of green, black, blue, artifact/graveyard synergies, which I think the deck was really cool. It was not totally optimized. There's something I was missing that wasn't quite getting there, but it was really fun to be able to line up stuff like Aftermath Analyst and Emery, which both on ETB just dump a bunch of creatures in the graveyard, and then use Armix that I have multiple copies of to discard more cards and use that as a removal spell, which, as you mentioned, was something that you were really looking for in this environment. So having that on an aggressive creature that could sort of push through some damage was fun. And then ultimately the way that I won most of the games that I did win was with a crazy card called Diamond Weapon, which who knows where this card comes from, but it's just like gets discounted for all the permanents in your graveyard, and then is an 8/8 with reach that can't be dealt damage, and your opponents get very frustrated by it. But I cast a number of those.
That's what I should have made your nickname for this episode, because you were a couple of years in, and we're definitely going Diamond Weapon
It was
a lot.
Yeah. Anyway, and then I also had a random Displacer Kitten, which ended up doing some funky little things, and a Marin of Clan Neltoth, which I don't think I ever drew, but yeah, and then actually, interestingly, also had 2 copies of Gilded Goose and a Lannis Cryptozoologist, and those creatures that weren't themselves artifact incidentally made some artifacts also came up a fair amount.
Yeah, see, I didn't see any Marins at my seat, and that was definitely a black, green, gold card that would point more to like a thematic synergy compared to Cheville.
Yeah, definitely.
Next up is Bolt Cube. This is a cube where you start at 3 life, and you also draft smaller packs. I forget what the pack was. It 4 by 11 or 3 packs of 11? 3 packs of 11, and build a 25 card deck, which are a couple rules modifications, but those are all rules modifications that you can kind of get out of the way early, right? The actual games, once you end up start playing, are normal. You do die from decking if you draw out of your deck, and there's actually pretty minimal card advantage or like really sort of careful attention paid to the card advantage, so you're pretty unlikely to deck yourself just by accident, but that is definitely a strategy you can pursue to try and deck your opponent. And I felt in this draft so lost.
It's a difficult draft.
I feel like I've drafted a lot of radical context shift cubes before. I've actually played this exact one before, but years ago when the card pool was quite different. And I just found myself reading a bunch of cards and saying, I have no idea how good that is here. How good is a 5-mana 2/2 that taps to gain 2 life? I have no idea. It could be broken or it could still be bad because this cube also has 1-mana removal and the card counterspell is here, right? Like a 5-mana card might just be an utter trap, or it has to be way better to actually count. So I really had a hard time evaluating cards in the draft, which meant that I just queued towards what I knew, which was cards that are only kind of slightly recontextualized here. So like I was taking things like Engineered Explosives and Swords to Plowshares. Swords to Plowshares massively recontextualized here because letting your opponent gain a couple life is a huge deal when dealing 3 damage is already very hard. For example, I also had Joustler. I think Joustler is probably the better removal spell compared to Swords to Plowshares because it mostly can remove anything that matters when it matters and also gains you a life, which is, like gaining 7 life basically in a normal game of Magic, which is kind of messed up.
But also maybe you get a big creature with Defender and then you Swords to Plowshares your own creature and it's like crazy life gain spell.
Yeah, it's a very sort of fiddly, the cards are all bad. Like you don't just get to play like I think the stat lines are like you can play 1 or 2 mana, 0 powered creatures, sometimes with flying, or you can pay 3 mana for a 1/1. Seems to be like the baseline stats. And then you can like try and put an equipment on your flyer, but the equipment's all bad. None of the equipment is efficient. It's like fishing rod is your equipment, and that's like a pretty good card. It was just like a very kind of interesting, puzzly environment that I ended up playing. Just started on Jeskai control and then realized I should just be main decking Pest Control, which is the black-white board wipe for permanents 1 mana value and less, non-land permanents 1 mana value and less. Because I had 2 white-black lands, and the fact that Pest Control has cycling in a 25-card deck means you can just play it with 2 black sources, and it's totally fine. So I ended up basically being 4-color control, splashing for that Pest Control, and my deck worked pretty well. My 2 win conditions were Thing in the Ice, which, a great example here, like, you get a 0-power creature that if you can cast 4 spells and flip it, and your opponent has no way to interact with it in between any of that time, then you get to, actually hit your opponent and probably win.
You get to hit them for 7. What even is that number? That number doesn't exist.
It's
or
huge.
8? Is it 8/7?
No,
Doesn't matter.
It's got 7 power. I know that much.
Great.
My other win condition was just milling my opponent out, not because I had any way to mill them, just because I would run them out of things with all of my control spells. I had Stillness in Motion, which is a 2-mana enchantment that at the beginning of your upkeep you mill 3, and then if your library is empty, you Doomsday Pile yourself, you stack 5 cards from your graveyard into your library in any order. And my favorite win was where I got to do that with Thing in the Ice in play, and it took me a while to make that 5-card pile to try and figure out what I thought my opponent might have as answers and what order I wanted to draw my cards in and when to go for flipping the Thing in the Ice in that sort of stack. It was a really sort of skill testing and challenging moment that I had a really good time navigating.
Something you said that I think is really important about this environment and the way that Keldon has designed it, he's very carefully redefined what rate means.
Yes.
We're so used to thinking about like, a 2-mana
The French
2/2,
vanilla test
or
here
like,
is very different.
Yeah, a 2-mana 3/2 is on rate, and if you get like a bonus on top of that, then it is above rate. If it's less, then it's a card you don't want to play. Here, that's, I think, what makes it so difficult to get a grip on, is it takes seeing more than one pack. I think it takes seeing quite a few packs before you get a sense of what that redefinition is, and understanding and trying to figure out if, like you said, like I have a 5-mana 1/5 Flying Vigilance in my deck, and I'm like, is this good? I have no idea. I don't know how easy it's going to be to remove. I don't really know how quick of a clock that represents. I ended up in a black-blue with a little bit of white deck. I think I did a good job of reading that black was extremely open and just jumped into that, drafted a lot of hand hate, a fair amount of removal, and also had Grind Clock as a win condition to mill my opponents out. The win conditions were light. People had enough interaction for my Grind Clock and my other couple creatures, so this was difficult. I'd be really interested in drafting this more. I don't think the first draft gives you a good impression of what this environment is like.
This is the one I definitely most wanted to run back after playing 3 matches and feeling like I had a better sense of what rate looked like in this cube. Because, yeah, like I said, I was trying to evaluate cards in the draft and just being like, I have no idea. I would fully believe that this is like a huge power outlier in this pack or like a D- sideboard card. I felt that way about half the cards in every single pack. I just truly did not know what was going on. Yeah, hewing to my familiarity bias led me down a certain path, which I ended up getting a 2-1. I think the control decks here, when you are playing a cube you're unfamiliar with like this, I think it's actually sometimes easier to be the control deck if you don't know what a proactive strategy looks like.
I don't know a good way to kill my opponent. I'm just going to stop my opponent from killing me.
Right. I mean, like if you don't know what a proactive deck looks like, it often becomes emergent through gameplay what thing you need to counter or remove from your opponent, right? Like one of my opponents was trying to kill me by paying 2 life to a Phyrexian mana and then having the enchantment Near Death Experience, which says at your upkeep, if you're at 1 life, you win the game. And it's 5 mana white enchantment. And that was their win condition, basically. And so I got to see as the game was going on, okay, that's how they're going to win. I need to prioritize Disenchants, or I need to Swords of Plowshare something at an opportune moment.
Swords of Plowshare is my opponent's thing to give them 1 life so they don't win the game for being at 1 life. That's awesome.
I literally did that, yeah. So playing a control deck in that kind of environment, as you start to learn what actually matters, you can figure out what to remove. But if you have no idea what a proactive deck looks like, then it's kind of hard to draft one.
Although sometimes, like, what's the type of interaction you need can be difficult to understand.
Yeah, that's hard.
The designer did mention that things like Sorcerer's Spyglass were very relevant, and I fortunately drafted it, and it was very powerful. And I realized sort of as the gameplay was going on, it's like, well, of course, if you're getting a 1 mana 0/1 and then you're trying to enhance it somehow, like, Sorcerer's Spyglass will interact with a lot of ways that creatures are being enhanced, and also a lot of those other engines that people are putting together.
That reminds me of my other win condition, which I'd forgotten about, which was Castle Ardenvale.
That was basically unbeatable to me.
Yeah, I mean, if 3 mana 1/1s are the baseline rate plus a card, then 5 mana for a 1/1 repeatedly on a land that you already have in your deck that takes up no card space is quite strong. And that was how I won a couple of my games. I was looking at my deck picture, and I didn't see it because it's in my land pile over here, but that was one of my other win conditions. Last draft of the weekend was the Bodleian Cube. This is a cube that I think Jake says in the overview is like somewhat inspired by the Bun Magic cube, and Jake has gone a different direction with it, though, I would say, and really kind of focused on trying to ride this razor's edge of good stuff magic and synergy, which the Bun Magic cube, I would say, kind of eschews synergy. It's like you're not going to get to do A plus B plus C synergy stuff. You really have to care about, interaction and like tempo and card advantage, right? Like I really care about the sort of high level macro considerations of a game in that cube and less so about individual card interactions. This cube prioritizes that a little bit more, and by dint of that, curves a little higher, and I think has a little less density of interaction compared to the Bun Magic cube, but is still nevertheless a very powerful, fair cube. There's not 2-card combos. You're going to have to do something on the fair axis to win the game, and you're playing a lot of Magic's most powerful spells. This was the last draft of the weekend, and I got past a Lurrus after first picking a Dragon's Rage Channeler, which I really hemmed and hawed between Dragon's Rage Channeler and Retrofitter Foundry in my first pick, and I think Retrofitter Foundry is the better pick. I think that's the better card that leads to a higher win percentage. I felt like I did not have the brain capacity left to play a dirtily Retrofitter Foundry deck, but Dragon's Rage Channeler, I felt I could play, red something aggro and get there.
Interesting strategy.
I mean, you got to draft what you feel like you can do at the moment.
Oh, I know.
I took Dragon's Rage Channeler, I got past Lurrus, and was sort of very grateful for Lurrus being a hard restriction on the cards I could care about in a pack. I just got to ignore everything that was a permanent 3-mana value and over, and just focus on what I could actually take. And I think my deck was pretty okay. I ended up going 2-1. I think in a cube like this, the Lurrus deck is probably not as good as it is in like the Bun Magic cube, for example, where there just isn't a lot of high curving stuff in the Bun Magic cube. So it's really a much smaller concession to Companion Lurrus there than it is here. There were a lot of really good cards I had to just pass on that were in my colors that I was seeing in the packs because I just had to, satisfy this Lurrus condition. Also, decks are capable of going bigger and doing sort of more flashy, explosive, high-end things, which a Lurrus deck often kind of can't compete with. I think on average, this deck is probably not great. This is probably like a 1-2 deck on average that I got 2-1 with just by getting a little bit lucky compared to like my regular cube draft deck, which I think was a 2-1 or maybe even better deck that I got a little unlucky and played some good opponents with and ended up 1-2. Variance is variance. But this deck, my highlight for sure was mulling to 5 in a game 3. My opponent kept 7, and they led on Inquisition of Kozilek Duress, 2 discard spells on my mull to 5, and I won that game handily.
That's kind of crazy. That seems like a lost cause.
Well, first of all, I got lucky, obviously. I top-decked perfectly. I drew exactly what I needed when I needed it, which was...
Good to acknowledge that when it happens.
Oh, it's for sure partially that. I also leaned really heavily on Nethergoyf, which they needed to take other things out of my hand, but left me with a Nethergoyf, which then was very quickly very large on account of them having discarded 2 of my cards and me having a fetch land. So that started attacking quite early. And the other thing I won with is my opponent played Bitter Blossom, and then that cost them a bunch of life, and I was able to get there. But I was reminded that, I think over the past couple of years, I have turned harder towards lower power cubes and sort of more interesting, weird designed cubes and away from just kind of playing Magic's most powerful cards. But I think games like that are one of the virtues of playing Magic's most powerful cards, because it is really hard to imagine any sequence of cards in, like, for example, the regular cube that can win on a mull to 5 when your opponent goes interactive spell on turn 1 and 2. You're never going to get there. And cards like Nethergoyf and Emperor of Bones was another card that played a big role in that particular game. Those cards are very explosive because of their individual power level, and they mean that you can, in some circumstances, have these big comebacks or win games you were otherwise heavily disfavored in, which is part of the fun of playing really powerful Magic.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I mean, I think that you could still have that broad sort of bell curve of types of games and type of interactions at lower power as well, but not lower power in the kind of like pretty narrow power band kind of cube like regular cube.
Well, I think it's like, some things in Magic are relative and some things are constants, right? You start the game with 7 cards in hand no matter what power level you're playing at. You get to play 1 land a turn no matter what power level you're playing
You
at.
say that, but in Anarchy Cube, somebody had a what was it?
The Vanguard spell, the Gerard Vanguard spell. They start at 3 but draw 2 cards every turn. For the most part, extreme outliers, notwithstanding, there are constants in the game, and I think mulling to 5 is one of the places where you often run up against those constants more than you run up against the relative power level things. And you're just like, well, I just think we don't have enough cards here to win, right? Like, if the power level of this cube is lower such that cards are not going to accrue 3-for-1s or greater, like, that's what I need. I need a card to basically 3-for-1 my opponent, which my Nethergoyf did over many turns by just being chump blocked repeatedly because they had to not die. Like, that's the kind of thing that you need to get out of a card to come back from, and that's where I think it's not always relative. I think you do have to acknowledge some of the sort of absolute power level of cards comes into play there.
Yeah, it's a good point. I was feeling pretty similar to you. This was our 8th draft over 4 days. That's a lot of Magic for me. Like, I was not honestly sure if I was going to make it to the end of this weekend without a completely fried brain.
I might die.
Could happen. Or might just like have to go out in the woods and watch birds and say, sorry, guys. But I made it, but I was tired. So pack one, pick one. Philia, Exuberant Shepherd. This is also one of Jake's favorite cards, and he's had it altered. And I thought mono white could be for me. This could be the easy aggro deck. This cube, you also start with the Cogwork Librarian, which many of the cubes we played included that. So I second picked, I think it was Adeline and pre-war formalware, and then from there just really tried to make
You just drafted my deck from the Anarchy cube, basically.
Yeah, I guess so. Did manage to get a lot of cheaper spells as well, and had a light black splash for a little bit of removal, and Servandum Sunstar Exemplar? Who knows what that is? It was pretty good. This I had some, I think, just some bad luck with some of my draws in this deck. I also had an Urza Saga, which wasn't super supported, but maybe was a little bit of a distraction for me. But fun games all around.
We should clarify. There's a Saga is definitely supported in the cube. You just didn't happen to have the deck for it because
correct,
no
yeah.
Retrofitter Foundries.
I had a fair amount of incidental things that are artifact. You know, my Esper Sentinel, Glimmer Lens, the pre-war formalware. Like, there were some other artifacts in play, but I didn't actually have a target to fetch from it, which was pretty much a problem.
Yeah.
And I think in an aggressive deck, I probably overrate Urza Saga because you don't necessarily always want to be doing that. Like, I think it's really good against a blue deck because you can play around counter spells very effectively. But outside of that, I did get to also double play it with Sarah Paragon one time. That was cool. That was a highlight.
I doubt you're overrating it. I think it's so strong. I think it's like better than any other colorless utility land short of Strip Mine in an aggro deck, basically.
Yeah, you might be right.
And that's it.
That's it.
That's Cube Cabin. It was a great time, and great to talk a bunch of cube design theory. There were people that had torn apart a cardboard box and were drawing all sorts of diagrams and graphs all over it. That was true beautiful mind stuff, trying to figure out how to define certain aspects of cards. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, we all sort of like had a Google Doc, split up meals. People were cooking on different days and doing different chores. And, you know, I think that I would definitely recommend people do a thing like this.
Yeah, go for it.
And things I would say keep in mind is like make sure you have a group that's willing to clean up the kitchen a little bit like we had, and share everything that it takes to not go crazy in a house with 8 people for 4 days.
That's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. If you want to support the show on Patreon, you can find a link in the show notes. We have hit our goal to subsidize editing, which I'm so grateful for. Thank you to everybody that has given me my weekends back. And that means that we're starting to look for what else we can do with some of that extra money, including funding some writing, hopefully, and also maybe sponsoring people to go to some events. So stay tuned for that. I'm working on the next steps for that as it seems to become clear that that will be a thing we can do. Though I do have to talk to my tax prep people and see what I should expect in terms of tax obligations. There's some things to iron out.
Still questions, but I mean, the main thing is just like, it's incredible how quickly people responded and how willing and generous people have been. And thanks.
This weekend,
everybody.
I came back on Sunday and had a sick dog, and I was like, if I had edited a podcast right now, I would be so depressed. And instead I got to like tend to my sick dog and tend to my poor spouse who was dealing with a sick dog all weekend. And it meant a lot. So, yeah. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and speaking into microphones about it. And the show is edited by Matthew. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thanks for hanging out in a cabin all weekend and watching birds and eating good food and playing way too much Magic.